In the parish records of East Baton Rouge, there is an entry that looks like a simple correction, but it has been haunting historians for more than a century and a half. In March of 1845, 17 plantation ledgers were altered on the very same day, all of them quietly rewriting the description of a single enslaved man. Not his age, not his health, but his appearance, as if the truth on the page was too dangerous to leave in ink. Within 18 months of his arrival, 7 powerful families abandoned the homes their ancestors had built and vanished from the capital region, leaving behind only rumors and carefully edited paper trails. The official stories talk about business failures, bad harvests, and family matters, but the private diaries tell a very different tale, a story of desire, terror, and one beautiful face that cracked the mask of Southern society. Tonight on Noctivox Dark Stories, we are opening those paper trails back up, following them from a Charleston auction house to a Baton Rouge courtroom where beauty itself was treated like a crime scene. Before we dive deeper, I'm curious, where are you watching from? Drop your city in the comments and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss a story like this. Now, take a breath, dim the lights if you can, because we are going back to 1844, to the suffocating humidity of Charleston, South Carolina, where human beings were displayed like livestock and where one man's appearance would do more damage than any armed rebellion ever did on that soil. Charleston, in 1844, was the beating heart of the domestic slave trade, a city where fortunes rose and fell on the sale of human bodies catalogued with the same brisk efficiency as cotton bales. At the corner of Chalmers and State stood Ryan's Mart, a 3-story complex whose brick walls had heard more prayers and screams than any church in the city. The auction block was worn smooth by decades of bare feet, its wood stained dark with sweat, tears, and the kind of residue that never quite washes away, no matter how hard you scrub. On a heavy September morning, when the heat pressed down like a hand on the back of your neck, the routine cruelty of that place was interrupted by something the auctioneer had never seen before. His name was Horace Veneman, and after 26 years of appraising human merchandise, he was suddenly staring at a man his ledgers could not politely describe. The enslaved man on the block was listed as Jules, approximately 23, property of the deceased Edgar Fontaine estate of Beaufort. Normally, the entry would have been a tight list of marks, scars, skills, and temperament, a few ugly shorthand lines to sum up a whole life. Instead, Veneman had written a full paragraph describing the man's face, his bearing, the way people reacted when he walked into a room, followed by a warning in cramped, uneasy script. Buyer discretion strongly advised, household placement only, fieldwork inadvisable due to attention factor. Jules's features were mathematically symmetrical, high cheekbones that caught the light, clear eyes under a strong brow, a jawline that looked like it belonged on a statue instead of an auction block, his skin smooth and unscarred, his body strong without brutality. But what really unsettled the traders was the intelligence in his gaze, the quiet dignity that made the chains look ridiculous, like a bad joke played by a terrified society on itself. The Fontaine family had known exactly what kind of trouble they were housing, which is why they kept Jules inside as a house servant, tightly controlling who saw him and for how long. They educated him in reading, writing, and French, not out of kindness, but to increase his value in the genteel market of domestic slaves, never imagining that thinking would be more dangerous than polishing silver. Now that Edgar Fontaine was dead and the estate was being liquidated, Jules was finally exposed to the general market like a secret dragged into daylight. The bidding that morning turned strange very quickly, as seasoned planters raised their paddles, stared too long, then abruptly dropped out as if scorched by something they did not want to name. 2 men nearly came to blows over bidding protocol. A woman in the gallery fainted, and when the hammer finally fell at $1,200, it was nearly 3 times the price of a prime field hand. The buyer of record was an agent for an anonymous planter in Louisiana, a man who believed he understood how to manage every variable life could throw at him. That man was Matthias Devo, 53 years old, widower, and patriarch of one of the most profitable sugar estates in the Baton Rouge district. He had built his fortune on calculated ruthlessness, on knowing exactly how far to push people, and where the invisible lines of Southern respectability were drawn. His plantation spread over 3,000 acres of fertile Mississippi River bottomland, worked by more than 200 enslaved people who moved under the watchful eyes of overseers like parts in a very cruel machine. The main house was a Greek revival showpiece, 16 rooms and 6 massive columns facing a gallery and manicured gardens that had been praised in Southern Cultivator magazine as a model of tasteful grandeur. Everything about the place said order, control, a man who believed the world could be arranged to his liking if he kept a tight enough grip on every detail. When he saw the daguerreotype of Jules and read the Charleston agent's letter, Matthias thought he saw a problem he could purchase, contain, and quietly profit from. Jules arrived at the Devo Plantation in early October of 1844, traveling by steamboat up the Mississippi and then by wagon along the river road, 11 days of movement without a single decision of his own. He spoke rarely during the journey, ate little, and kept a neutral expression that told the white men nothing and saved what was left of his inner life. The overseer escorting him wrote a short report that described Jules as unnaturally composed, showing no signs of resistance or visible emotion, his condition excellent, his potential value high if managed correctly. Matthias's plan was simple on paper. He would use Jules as a personal valet, a role that kept him mostly inside the main house and firmly under the master's eye, while limiting his exposure to both white visitors and the general slave population. For the first 3 months, the arrangement seemed to work, at least from above. Jules laid out clothes, prepared shaving water, moved like a quiet shadow in and out of business meetings, present but invisible in the way that good servants were trained to be. But invisibility and beauty do not coexist for long inside a pressure cooker like an antebellum plantation, and the first cracks appeared inside Matthias's own family. Catherine, his 19-year-old daughter, began calling for Jules to adjust curtains, fetch books, and carry trivial messages, tasks that could have been done by any house servant but somehow always required him. Her younger sister Elise developed a habit of drifting into rooms where Jules was working, pretending to search for misplaced items while her eyes lingered a beat too long on his face. Nathaniel, the eldest son, reacted with brittle anger, making loud comments at dinner about house slaves forgetting their place and suggesting that certain individuals might be better suited to the fields. Marcus, the quieter brother, said very little, but he watched Jules with a tight, complicated expression that mixed jealousy, curiosity, and something he would never dare voice out loud. The social order had no script for a beautiful enslaved man, and everyone around him started improvising badly. Just beyond the Devo property line stood Oak Grove Plantation, owned by Laurent Desamp, whose estate was smaller but just as profitable and closely tied to the Devo family by business, hunting parties, and slow, formal dinners. His wife, Vivienne Desamp, was 28 and famous in parish gossip for her beauty, a former New Orleans society ornament whose marriage in 1839 had been a major social event. She first saw Jules at a Christmas week dinner, when the house was full of evergreen branches, candlelight, and the brittle cheer of people pretending everything was fine. He moved through the dining room with a tray of wine, the perfect servant, eyes down until, for just a second, they were not. Their gazes met, her hand trembled, and a streak of dark wine spilled onto the white tablecloth, spreading slowly like a stain that refused to behave. From that moment, Vivian found more and more excuses to visit the Devo house, and every excuse somehow placed her in the same rooms and corridors where Jules had become impossible to fully hide. Servants notice things that their owners think are invisible, and it did not take long for whispers to start moving between the Devo and Desamp kitchens. They noticed that Vivian's visits lined up suspiciously well with the times when Jules was serving in the house instead of working out of sight. They noticed how her gaze followed him as he crossed a room, how she asked idle questions that made him stay in her presence a few seconds longer. Lauren noticed too, watching his wife with a tight jaw and reaching for the bottle a little earlier each evening, the quiet humiliation curdling into something darker. Under growing pressure, Matthias made what he thought was a strategic move, reassigning Jules from house service to the plantation's carpentry shop, a large outbuilding 200 yards from the main house. In his mind, he had not created a moral crisis. He had merely relocated a problem, turning beauty into another tool that could be handled by someone who understood the unspoken rules of survival. The carpentry shop was run by Abraham, an enslaved man in his late 40s who had spent 15 years building furniture, repairing structures, and carefully avoiding the kinds of trouble that got people sold or killed. When Jules walked in on his first day, Abraham took one long look at him and saw not a co-worker, but a walking catastrophe waiting for a spark. "You are going to get people killed just by existing, you understand that, do you not?" he told Jules, handing him a plane to smooth a board, his voice more tired than cruel. Jules answered with silence, the same shield he had used his whole life, and that silence told Abraham that this man understood more than was safe for any slave to admit. Later, when he learned how Jules had been taught to read and speak French by the Fontaine family to increase his market value, Abraham shook his head and called it what it was, another dangerous luxury given by people who never thought about consequences. "A man who looks like you and thinks like you is something this world is not built to handle," he said, half warning, half prophecy, as the soft rasp of the plane filled the shop. February brought an unusual cold snap to Louisiana, frost tracing delicate patterns on windows while tempers grew shorter in cramped, overheated rooms. On the 9th, Matthias hosted a business dinner for several neighboring planters and their wives, a closed-door strategy session about abolitionist pamphlets leaking in from New Orleans and rumors of rebellion that had everyone on edge. The regular house staff was thin with illness, and in a decision he would replay in his mind for the rest of his life, Matthias pulled Jules back into the main house for the evening to help serve. As bourbon flowed in the parlor and the talk turned to sugar prices and legislation, the women's eyes tracked Jules the way iron filings follow a magnet, some openly, some with deliberate effort not to look. The men felt the shift like a change in air pressure, and in that kind of fragile, alcohol-soaked tension, it only took one wounded ego to blow the whole facade apart. Laurent was the one who finally detonated, his drinking outpacing everyone else's, as he watched his wife pointedly not watch Jules. In the middle of a discussion about cotton futures, he cut in with a cold suggestion that stricter rules were needed for which slaves were allowed in mixed company, saying some individuals brought complications that outweighed their usefulness. Everyone understood exactly who he meant, even before he gestured toward the wall where Jules stood motionless with another servant, the perfect target who could not answer back. Matthias tried to shut him down with polite fury, insisting he knew how to manage his own property, but Laurent pushed harder, accusing him of parading that creature in front of decent women and pretending nothing was wrong. By the time one of the other guests suggested moving the conversation to cigars and leaving the ladies to their coffee, the damage was already baked in, and Vivian's pale face and rigid smile said more than any words. The dinner ended early, with stiff goodbyes, and as Vivian left, she cast one last look into the shadowed hallway where Jules stood, a look her husband saw and would never forget. The next morning, Matthias removed Jules from all house duties permanently, ordering that he work only in the carpentry shop and stay away from the main house under any circumstances. Abraham was given the unofficial job of jailer, told to keep Jules busy and out of sight, and to make sure his path never crossed that of visiting white women again. But distance and doors could not undo what had already happened, and the situation across the fence at Oak Grove grew stranger by the day, with Vivian withdrawing from social life while Lauren simmered in quiet rage. On the afternoon of March 7th, with her husband away in New Orleans on business, Vivian finally did something that no one in her position was supposed to even imagine. She walked out of her house without a carriage, cut across fields and a strip of woods, mud clinging to the hem of her dress, and stepped into the doorway of the carpentry shop where Jules and Abraham were working. Abraham looked up, saw her eyes locked onto Jules like a drowning woman sighting air, and felt every survival instinct in his body scream at once. She demanded to speak to Jules alone, her voice brittle and shaking, and Abraham refused as politely as a terrified man could, telling her that both her husband and Matthias would have his hide if he allowed it. Vivian said she was not leaving, and Jules, realizing Abraham was standing between them and death, told his friend quietly that it was all right, that nothing good was going to come from arguing with a white woman who had clearly reached some breaking point. What followed was not a seduction scene the gossip later imagined, but something far messier, a confession from a woman who felt herself suffocating in a life she was supposed to be grateful for. Vivian told Jules she had spent 6 months trying to starve her feelings into submission, believing them to be madness, and that she had finally reached a choice: stay in a gilded cage and die slowly inside, or walk away from everything with him. She begged him to leave with her that night, to flee by the river to New Orleans and then on to Mexico or California or any place where the categories of white mistress and enslaved man did not come with a death sentence. Jules listened, and for the first time since arriving at the Devo plantation, the calm mask on his face cracked, not with desire, but with horror at the sheer naivety of the fantasy she was offering. He told her flatly that the law considered him property, that running away with him would not be romance, it would be theft, and that men like her husband specialized in making examples out of enslaved men accused of even imagined impropriety. He spelled out the reality she had never been forced to look at, that she had been trapped by social expectations for a few years, while he had been trapped by chains, whips, and the auction block his entire life, and that pretending those cages were equivalent was obscene. When she insisted she could not go back to her old life, he told her she would, and that she had to, because every other path ended with his body hanging from a tree and her name spat like a curse until the day she died. In the end, she left sobbing into the darkening woods, her dress torn, her hair coming loose, while Abraham and Jules stared at the open doorway knowing something terrible had just shifted, even though nothing physical had happened between them. What none of them knew was that they had already gained an unwanted witness, a slave woman from Oak Grove named Ruth, who had followed her mistress at a distance, worried by her strange behavior. Ruth saw Vivian enter the carpentry shop alone and later emerge in tears, and in a world built on surveillance and punishment, there was only one thing she could safely do with that information. She reported it to the head housewoman at Oak Grove, who took it straight to the overseer, who took it straight to Laurent when he stepped off the coach from New Orleans. Within 24 hours, every plantation in the parish had a version of the story, each retelling adding its own spice, some saying there had been embraces, some insisting Jules had violently rejected Vivian, others inventing whispered plans for escape. Lauren responded not with a private beating or a quiet sale, but with something far more explosive. A formal petition to the parish court on March 9th accusing Matthias of failing to control a dangerous piece of property. Overnight, a private scandal became a matter of public record, and a judge named Edmond Thibodeau found himself staring at a case that threatened to tear a hole right through the logic of the system he had spent his career defending. Behind the official proceedings, another, darker process was taking shape, as a group of planters calling themselves the Committee for Preservation of Natural Order began meeting more frequently at the plantation of Thomas Hartwell. Their goal was simple: to protect the plantation system by any means they could not admit in daylight, and in Jules they saw not just a man, but a symbol that needed to disappear. They listened to Lauren describe the way his wife had looked at an enslaved man and decided this was not just a personal humiliation, it was a threat to white supremacy itself, proof that the natural hierarchy needed a lot more help than polite society liked to admit. While lawyers drafted arguments, the committee drafted something far cruder, a plan to remove Jules from the world before the trial could drag their private sins into public light. The cage was rattling, and the men who built it were preparing to kill the one person whose mere existence made them see its cracks. On the night of March 22nd, the Devo plantation was jolted awake when an enslaved man from the Broussard place staggered into the quarters, bloody and half-conscious. His name was Benjamin, and he had been beaten and stabbed and left for dead, but somehow he had dragged himself 4 miles to reach Matthias's land. As the plantation's doctor worked in a rush of lamplight to stop the bleeding, Abraham leaned close to hear the fragments Benjamin kept repeating through the pain. "They are coming for him, the ones who meet at Bellefonte. They are planning something tomorrow night. They cannot let it go to trial. Tell Jules." Benjamin died without giving names, but it was enough. Abraham went straight to Matthias, shaking him awake with a message that made all of the planters' careful calculations feel suddenly flimsy. Matthias ordered Jules moved from the barn storage room into a root cellar hidden beneath the main house, a space built years earlier as a panic room during rebellion scares, and locked him inside with a stack of books and the first honest conversation they had ever had. In that cramped underground room, Jules asked the question any rational person would ask: why not just sell him now, send him downriver and wash their hands of the whole mess? Matthias admitted that he could, that every instinct as a businessman told him to turn this human problem back into money and be done with it, but that there were other stakes now, stakes about power, reputation, and the precedent this case would set for every plantation in Louisiana. He told Jules that if he allowed the committee to murder a man on his property, he would never again be the true master of his own land, and that he would rather fight in court than admit those other planters had authority over him. In a rare flicker of honesty, he also admitted that hearing Jules speak to Vivian about the difference between social imprisonment and slavery had forced him to confront truths he had spent his life avoiding. "If I admit you are right, I have to admit this whole system is built on lies, and I am not ready to do that, so I will protect you instead," he said, the most twisted, backhanded form of protection a man in his position could offer. Above their heads, Abraham was piecing together the full story of the committee's plan, and the parish was sliding toward a confrontation no one could fully control. Matthias did something the committee never expected. He dragged their secret war into the open by sending urgent messages to the parish sheriff, to Judge Thibodeau, and to several planters he knew were not involved in the clandestine group. He claimed he had reliable information about a possible raid on his property by unknown parties seeking to damage his interest before the trial, and by afternoon, the Devo estate looked less like a private home and more like an armed outpost. The sheriff arrived with deputies, neutral planters rode in with overseers, and the judge sent a clerk to observe, making it clear that any violence tonight would come with witnesses and ink, the two things the committee feared most. Realizing their delicate plan was compromised, most members backed away from direct action, unwilling to risk open charges, but Lauren was too drunk and too wounded in pride to retreat. At 8 in the evening, he rode up alone, pistol visible, demanding to see Matthias, and the two men faced each other in the front parlor with the sheriff watching, the tension in the room as sharp as the metal in their hands. What followed was a brief, chaotic struggle in which Lauren grabbed for his gun, the sheriff fired, and a bullet tore through Lauren's shoulder as he turned toward the back of the house, perhaps imagining Jules hurtling out of some hidden door. Bleeding and stunned, Lauren stared at Matthias with something like clarity breaking through the alcohol as he clutched his ruined arm. "This is what you have chosen. This is what we have all become. This is what happens when we admit our system can be destroyed by a single beautiful face. We are already dead, all of us. We just do not know it yet," he said before collapsing. He lived, but the attempt at vigilante justice shattered his standing and made the committee's existence harder to deny, turning him from righteous accuser into the man who tried to bring murder into a fellow planter's parlor. With the covert option burned away, there was no more hiding behind shadows and backrooms. The case of Desamp versus Devo was going to court in full daylight. While Lauren recovered and drank himself deeper into bitterness, the days before the trial turned the parish into a pressure cooker of gossip and fear, with every family projecting their own anxieties onto the figure of an enslaved man they barely knew. And beneath the main house, in the dim root cellar, Jules read history and philosophy by lamplight, fully aware that strangers were about to argue his fate in words that would never once question whether they had the right to own him in the first place. March 25, 1845, the parish courthouse was packed from floor to gallery, people pressing into the brick building to watch a trial that pretended to be about negligence but was really about race, desire, and the flimsy myths propping up the slave society of Louisiana. Judge Thibodeau opened proceedings by reminding everyone that this was technically a civil suit, Laurent suing Matthias for damages for the alleged mishandling of dangerous property, but no one in that room was fooled. Lauren's lawyer, a sharp-faced man named Gideon Cross, painted Jules as a biological and social anomaly whose very presence in polite spaces had corrupted white women of quality and destabilized the moral order. He called Dr. Marcus Clayton, who gave cold anthropological measurements and described Jules as a rare, almost freakish combination of features that no reasonable master could have anticipated, turning him into a specimen instead of a man. He called Eugenia Broussard, who admitted through tears that Jules's presence at the dinner had distracted her mind in ways that frightened her, and Thomas Hartwell, who hinted at committee discussions about threats to white supremacy without ever naming them openly. The most dramatic moment of Lauren's case came when Vivian took the stand, looking years older than she had at that Christmas dinner, her face pale, her hands trembling as she swore to tell the truth. In a low, steady voice that sometimes broke, she admitted that she had believed herself in love with Jules, that she had walked to the carpentry shop ready to abandon her marriage, her status, and everything she was supposed to value in exchange for a life with an enslaved man. She told the court that Jules had refused her, that he had warned her their fantasy would end in violence and death, and that he had insisted her gilded cage was not the same as his chains. Then she did something no one expected. She turned her testimony into an indictment of the system itself, saying that if she could feel real attraction for someone she was taught to see as property, then either she was broken or the categories themselves were lies. The courtroom erupted, with Judge Thibodeau banging his gavel and ordering her to stick to facts. But the words were already loose in the air, and there was no way to herd them back into a place where they felt safe. When it was Matthias's turn, his lawyer, Clement Rousseau, chose a different strategy, one that tried to protect his client without protecting the moral structure everyone was clinging to. Rousseau did not deny that Jules had caused disruption. He argued instead that the disruption came entirely from the reactions of free white people who refused to control themselves. He pointed out that Jules had never pursued any woman, never initiated contact, and in fact had done everything he could to make himself invisible and discourage attention. He dragged the committee into the light by referencing Benjamin's death and the planned illegal raid, suggesting that the real threat to social order came from men who would rather form secret militias than trust the courts they claimed to respect. Then he asked Judge Thibodeau for something almost unheard of in such a case: permission for the enslaved man at the center of it all to testify in his own words. Legally, it was barely possible. Enslaved people could sometimes give testimony under tightly controlled conditions, though their words were usually treated as lesser than those of any free white witness. Morally, it was dynamite, and the judge knew it, which is exactly why, after a long pause and a look around the packed room, he allowed it, deciding that leaving Jules' voice out would make the entire proceeding ring hollow. When Jules walked to the stand in clean but simple clothes, without shackles, the silence in the room felt heavy enough to fall and shatter. He answered Rousseau's questions in an educated voice that unsettled those who still clung to the belief that enslaved people were naturally childlike, explaining calmly that he had not asked to be purchased, had not asked for his face, had not encouraged Vivian or anyone else. My existence is not an action, it is simply a fact. If my appearance alone counts as an action, then I am guilty just by existing, and there is no defense I can offer, he said, laying bare the absurd logic of putting him on trial for being looked at. Cross tried to break him on cross-examination, pushing him to admit some kind of manipulation, but Jules held steady, pointing out that he was the only person in that room who had never been allowed to choose anything about the situation. The courtroom left that day fractured, part of the audience furious that an enslaved man had been allowed to speak with such clarity, part of it shaken by the realization that his reasoning was far more coherent than the stories they told themselves about natural order. Judge Thibodeau retreated to his chambers to write a decision that he knew would satisfy no one and yet keep the machine turning a little longer. 3 days later, he delivered a 23-page judgment that cleared Matthias of legal negligence, acknowledging that Jules had done nothing improper and that his owner could not be held responsible for the private fantasies of others. At the same time, the opinion recommended new parish protocols for exceptional enslaved individuals whose characteristics might cause social disruption, including restrictions on movement, stricter supervision, and strong consideration of selling them away from the community. It was a perfect piece of compromised cruelty. Matthias kept his reputation, Lauren lost his case but got the system reinforced, and Jules was officially declared blameless while remaining nothing more than property on paper. Everyone walked away angry and unsatisfied, which meant the law had done its job of preserving the structure while pretending to examine it. Within 2 weeks of that so-called victory, Matthias sold Jules to a cotton broker from Natchez for $900, taking a loss on the investment he had fought so hard to defend. He told himself it was a business decision, that keeping Jules in Baton Rouge would mean endless whispers and eyes on his house, but everyone close enough to see the truth knew it was also an act of cowardice, a way of avoiding the daily cognitive dissonance of owning the man whose testimony had shaken his daughter's faith in everything she had been raised to believe. Lauren eventually finalized a divorce from Vivian, one of the first bitterly contested splits of its kind in Louisiana, and drank himself into an early grave by 1851, his arm half useless, his pride reduced to angry stories told to men too polite to walk away. Vivian moved to Philadelphia, where she quietly attached herself to abolitionist circles and, after the Civil War, to efforts to educate freedmen in the South, never publicly naming Jules but carrying the ghost of that choice she never made for the rest of her life. Catherine stayed unmarried, eventually running the Devo business interests herself and, according to her diary, funneling money to underground railroad operations while maintaining a public mask of loyalty to the Confederacy. The secret committee dissolved under the weight of its own exposure, members distancing themselves and whispering each other's names when talk turned to cowards and fools. As for Jules, the paper trail thinned quickly once he left Baton Rouge, showing two more sales, one in Natchez in 1846 and another in Memphis in 1847, before vanishing into the fog of the interstate slave trade. Some historians like to imagine he escaped during the chaos of the Mexican-American War, slipping across a border or onto a northbound route when patrols were thin and attention was elsewhere. Others, more grim, note the cholera epidemics that rolled through the Mississippi River Valley in those years and suggest he may have died nameless in a crowded fever ward or a remote camp, another body in a system that treated bodies as fuel. For decades, all that remained of his story and official narratives was a brief mention of a complicated court case in Baton Rouge and a line or two about social tensions in a Plantation museum brochure. The real pulse of the story stayed buried in private journals, misfiled paperwork, and one piece of writing that Jules himself left behind during those days when he was locked in the root cellar under the Devo house. In 1923, a researcher named Helen Castere was digging through Louisiana state archives for antebellum court records when she stumbled on a folder from Desamp versus Devo that had been stuck in the wrong box, and inside it she found his voice on paper. On a single sheet, dated March 22, 1845, Jules had written out the thoughts no one in that courtroom wanted to hear spoken so plainly, the thoughts that never appeared in Judge Thibodeau's careful legal prose. He wrote that the men around him would decide what happened to him as they had decided everything since he was born, that they would argue about who was at fault and who deserved compensation, but would never ask the only question that mattered, by what right they owned him at all. He called that question too dangerous because if anyone in power asked it honestly, the entire structure of their world would begin to collapse, stone by stone. He predicted that the court would find some compromise that let everyone save face while he was sold, moved, or quietly disposed of, and life went on, but he also insisted that he understood exactly what was happening and why. Every time someone like Mrs. Desamp questions the categories she has been taught, every time someone like Miss Catherine starts thinking instead of accepting, the foundation cracks a little more. I will not live to see it fall, but it will fall. Everything built on lies eventually does, he wrote, leaving a message for a future he would never meet. Castere published the document in a small academic journal in 1924, where it was mostly ignored at the time but later resurfaced in civil rights scholarship and in a footnote of a 1955 book on Louisiana legal history. Meanwhile, the old Devo plantation was turned into a museum, its white columns scrubbed, its gardens trimmed, and its tours carefully curated to mention an 1845 scandal in vague, sanitized terms. Guides talk about a complicated legal case involving enslaved people and social tensions, without dwelling on the fact that an entire parish nearly tore itself apart over the question of whether a beautiful enslaved man could be treated as fully human. The root cellar where Jules once sat and wrote his note has been sealed off as structurally unsafe. The carpentry shop was demolished in the 1890s, and the courthouse where the trial took place burned in 1861, taking most of its records with it. What is left are scattered documents in archives, private diaries in family collections, and one piece of paper where a man classified as property calmly explained why the system that owned him was already dying. In the end, this story is not about a magical face or some supernatural curse. It is about how fragile a society becomes when it is built on the constant denial of other people's humanity, and how dangerous it is when someone finally forces you to see that humanity in a form you were never meant to desire. What do you think happened to Jules after Memphis? Do you believe he found a way out? Or do you think the truth about his final years is still lying in some sealed box or forgotten attic? Do you think everything important about this case came out in that courtroom, or are there still pieces missing, hidden behind polite family legends and burned records? Let me know in the comments what you believe and whether you think beauty alone can really threaten an empire built on violence, or if it was always the ideas that followed behind it, quietly loosening the stones. If this story crawled under your skin and made you look at familiar history in a different way, hit the like button. It helps Noctivox Dark Stories reach more people who can handle this kind of darkness. Make sure you are subscribed with the notification bell on so you never miss the next tale from the shadows of America's past. I will see you in the next video, and until then, remember, the past does not stay buried. It just waits for someone to open the file.